Good evening and welcome to our program on anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism on American college campuses. This program is sponsored by Under One Tent, the signature program of the Contra Costa Jewish Community Center, and in partnership with Congregation B'nai Shalom, Congregation B'nai Tikva, and Diablo Valley Hadassah. Thank you everyone for attending. This lecture will be recorded so you can recommend it to your friends, neighbors, co-workers, etc. I also want to take the opportunity to wish everyone a happy Shavuot, which will begin on Thursday night. Hag Sameach to everyone. And now it is my great pleasure to first thank Mark Yudof and to read just a little bit of his bio. He served as the 19th president of the University of California from June 2008 through September 13, and is a professor of law emeritus at the University of California, Berkeley. He also served as chancellor of the University of Texas for several years and is president of the four-campus University of Minnesota. He is a renowned authority on constitutional law, freedom of expression, and education law, and earned both his undergraduate and law degrees from the University of Pennsylvania. And now, just to remind people, you could ask him questions using the chat function located at the bottom of your computer screen. And after his formal presentation, I will read the questions to Mark Yudof. Now, Mark, thank you so much again, and take it away.
Riva, thank you. What can I say? We miss our many friends in the Bay Area and all of California. And it's a pleasure to be with you tonight and to see some old friends on my screen. I'm also a big admirer, I have to say, of Under 110. And when Joanna and Riva hatch a plot, usually they have me. So what can I say? And I'm also grateful that so many of you have decided to attend and participate. And I suspect you already have some knowledge of the topic, which is, anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism on campus. Unfortunately, you have some in your backyard at Berkeley, but the truth is virtually every public and private university around the country has such incidents in their backyard. And that's part of the problem. And, the main question is, what do we do as a community to assist and deal with these challenges and the challenges confronting Jewish faculty members and students and staff? I should tell you that, as you probably know, I'm a non-executive chair of something called the Academic Engagement Network, which is on 200 campuses and has just under 1,000 faculty members and some administrators. And just to be clear, it's a very value-driven organization. So you probably know where I stand anyhow, but we are pro-Israel. We are pro-robust discussions about Israel, honest, candid, open discussions about Israel. We're opposed to the boycott movement, to boycott Israeli businesses and certainly universities. We're opposed to the anti-Semitism that we see too frequently these days. And we work with our professors, with administrators, with diversity, equity, and inclusion officers, student affairs people. We make grants, we do other things. What I should say is that there are exceptions, but there are very few organizations that really have a constituency on campus to help sort out these problems as they arise. What come to mind are organizations like Hillel, both the local Hillels and Hillel International, Chabad, the Israel on Campus Coalition, the Stand With Us movement. But whenever you're looking to see who you should support and who you should look to for guidance, I think it's best to look at organizations that have an understanding of the campuses and have a constituency on the campus. Sometimes, and I won't name them, but I see organizations that have one staffer, in one large city somewhere in the nation, who tries to keep track of campus developments, and they claim to be a major force on campus, and frequently they're not. They're just not. They don't have the horsepower to do it. They don't have the president. Having said all that, I want to speak tonight primarily as a recovering law professor, as Riva sort of mentioned, and a sojourning retired administrator, and not for anyone else. As you probably have sensed from the newspapers and from the media coverage, and certainly the Jewish media, these are very difficult times on many university campuses. I wouldn't say it's unsafe for Jewish students. We have very few examples of assaults, things like that, but we have examples of intimidation and of mezuzahs being torn down and confrontations and other things that happen that really make Jewish students and faculty feel unwelcome. If I were speaking to you 5 or 7 years ago, I'd have said the primary problems were the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, so-called BDS resolutions, most of them in the student body, incendiary speakers who came to campus, and the occasional swastika or similar thing, which was completely anathema to Jewish people. Those crises still arise today, but I think the developments are more insidious, if I can put it that way. I think, unfortunately, as the ADL has documented, there's a rising level of overt anti-Semitism. I thought Rabbi Adam, who you probably know from the Berkeley Hillel, once said to me that part of the problem today is the issues are more about hate and not just about policy disagreements. And Hillel has, of course, experienced that, some what I consider very offensive incidents that have occurred outside of the Hillel. And it also manifests itself through official departmental speech condemning Israel. Not too long ago, 120 gender studies departments across the country, when hostilities broke out between the Palestinians in Gaza and Hamas and Israel, they issued statements that made no mention of the 4,000 rockets, no mention of the history of the Jewish people, but identified Israel as the aggressor, the colonizer, the wrongdoer in that unfortunate occurrence. There are other things which are more subtle. There are Zionist faculty members who are afraid to speak up for fear of retribution. They may be in an American Studies department, they may be in an English department, the history department at the University of Illinois, but it's contrary to the established narrative in their department, and sometimes even what the department has officially said. These may be departments that have no particular focus on the Middle East or religious studies or anything like that, but nonetheless, they feel emboldened to speak for the department, for all the students, and for the faculty. And frequently, the universities have done very little to counter that narrative, despite some discomfort among administrators and board members. There's a narrative out there that identifies all Jews as privileged, white, and pro-Zionist. And they're not all white, they're not all privileged, they're not all pro-Zionist, and they're not colonizers, and it's certainly not engaged in any ethnic cleansing, but those are the types of narratives that one sees. Ethnic studies initiatives, and we shall see what happens in California, typically in the high schools and the universities, but more, I guess, in the high schools, disparage or omit mention of the history of the Jewish people. They may be seeking to be inclusive, but that does not include that. And at best, there's silence, and oftentimes there is hostility. There's exclusion of Jewish students from progressive student organizations. I once chaired the Jewish Student Life Committee at Berkeley, and we had like 5 student members there, and they would on the committee, and they would often say that I'm an advocate for doing something about climate change. I'm an advocate for LGBTQ plus rights. I'm an advocate for procreational freedom or whatever, the progressive cause. But it's made clear to me that I have to hang my Zionism up before I can join or at least participate heavily in these organizations. And then, of course, there are efforts to deny Zionists from speaking on campus. And, I'm sure you're all aware of the actions of some student organizations at Berkeley Law to prevent pro-Zionists from speaking. And apparently it doesn't matter what they're speaking on. It may have, for all I know, they're speaking about wills and estates or federal taxation, but they would be excluded by this ban of all Zionists. And I consider that an enormous problem. I also consider that to be in dereliction of the First Amendment rights of students and faculty. You all have seen this. It's a history of the Jewish people, but too often we are connected to every perceived evil in the world. Part of that's intersectionality, which for our purposes simply means that anytime you have prejudice and violence and other issues, whether it's police sanctioned murders or it's COVID or it's police training or whatever, there's always an effort to say Israel is responsible for this. If they hadn't had that course for police officers, we would not have had this event in Missouri or in Minnesota or elsewhere. Were it not for something the Israelis did wrong, we wouldn't have COVID, or we'd have more of the vaccine. It's very conspiratorial. It goes back to the history of conspiracies about Jewish people, that the elders of Zion sat down and divided up the world, and this is very similar. As part of all this, progressive pro-Israeli individuals, whether professors or students, are polemically described as pinkwashing or greenwashing. You're trying to hide your Zionist identity by identifying with other causes. And we've seen other things recently. The University of Chicago students organized a boycott of Israeli professors. We've seen efforts to abolish longstanding programs at Tel Aviv, Haifa, and other Israeli universities. There's an effort to isolate Israel. The most recent one of these is from the American Anthropological Society, and I've read their association, but I've read their stuff, and I guess someone can quote me, but they're really not written in English. Maybe I'm thinking Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict, but that's not what they're writing. It's very dense writing, and but anyhow, they want to establish a boycott, which they assure us is not a violation of academic freedom, but it is. They want to cut off relationships with Israeli researchers, Israeli students, Israeli faculty. It is pernicious. And my neutral principle is, even if you hate the regime, I think there is usually benefit in trying to keep alive university connections. And I would say that about Cuba and Venezuela, even if I disagree with those regimes. And I certainly feel strongly that Israel, falsely accused in most cases, deserves the same sort of treatment of its great universities. As for administrators, I don't really know that I've ever met an administrator who I thought was hostile to Jewish people. But I do think many of them fail to understand the impact of anti-Israel calumnies on campus climate. Many of them don't have a full appreciation of the history of the Jewish people. Many of them don't distinguish between the religion of Judaism and the peoplehood of Judaism. Many of them don't know that all Israelis are not white. Not all Jews in the United States are white. And I could go on and on with the things that they don't know. They're very good at denouncing swastikas or a noose hanging in a library which usually can be attributed to the far right, but they tread more carefully when they ignore similar developments on the left. That's just my view of the matter. Some, I think, fear the campus reaction to denouncing anti-Semitism. You know when it's half-hearted when you have an anti-Semitic incident, but it never mentions Jews. It never mentions anti-Semitism. It just says, isn't hate a terrible thing? And we want to be an inclusive community. They wouldn't say that, in my judgment, if this were racist or if this were homophobic or misogynist, but they will, some administrators will say that and not denounce anti-Semitism for what it is. And they won't do anything systemic to deal with it. It's one press release at best about that. When it comes to departmental statements, which I think should be frowned upon, departments should not speak in their official capacities for any part of the university. These administrators mostly buck the tough issues, frequently assigning them to unresponsive faculty committees that are unwilling to tackle the real issues. And what is most important, they are unwilling to provide the moral leadership, even as they rightly protect freedom of expression. I would not deny a podium to anyone that the university invites. And I say that whether it's an anti-Semite, a Ku Klux Klan member, or just someone that I disagree with on policy grounds. But universities have a voice too, and they can speak up and they can condemn it and say it doesn't represent our values, and this is not where our university is headed, and this is what we plan to do about it. And a more systemic response would be called for, something in the orientation programs, something in the communications to students, something in the training for mid-level administrators who are frequently have more of these responsibilities than the deans, the provost, and the university presidents and chancellors. In this regard, to skip ahead a little bit, I see 4 sets of developments that are likely to confront us in the year ahead and maybe in further years. First, and some of these may be obvious to you, so I hesitate to emphasize them too much. The new right of center government in Israel will occasion harsh criticism on campus and will be a rallying cry for BDS and other anti-Israel activities. Whatever your personal views of the government are, that's not my issue. My issue is, will it be used as fodder, as grist for the mill for anti-Israel activities on campus? The critique of Israeli national policy will be confounded with the belief that Israel should not exist at all. And to me, that's a very different sort of type of approach. It's one thing to say the Chinese policy that is mistaken, or the Chinese government should have done this or not done that. It's quite another thing to say there shouldn't be a China. And that's really, that foundational step is one that is often taken. When hostilities break out with Hamas, as they recently did, as they did in the recent past, those will further inflame our opponents. We see that all the time. And the treatment will not be it's not smack of any fairness at all, but would be very one-sided. Another example, although I don't think it's made it into the media as much, has been the efforts at reforming the judiciary in Israel, or changing, or some would say degrading, or whatever the proper verb or adjective would be. But it has been a big topic of conversation. And I have to tell, I'll be honest, I'm one of those who think the government proposal went too far, although I also am critical of some of the Supreme Court's decisions, the Israeli Supreme Court's decisions. And I'm hopeful that we'll be able to maintain an independent judiciary while reaching some compromise on what are some very serious issues in terms of Israel. But an independent judiciary to me is sine qua non with maintaining a democracy. They do not exist in any democratic regimes around the world. The second thing is the Supreme Court of the United States is likely to strike down affirmative action at the end of its term in June. And it really doesn't matter much whether your position is pro or anti-affirmative action. This is a prediction, reading the tea leaves and going over the oral arguments before the justices and their voting records. And that decision on affirmative action, and it may not be widely reported in the newspaper, will have consequences for Jewish faculty and students on the campuses, on academic freedom, for the Academic Engagement Network, for Hillel, Bod, and others. Such a reversal, of course, would be viewed by many as an attack on diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives and offices, and many campuses have quite a number of DEI officers, and on campus bureaucratic structures generally. How DEI offices will change, if at all, or to what extent, is not clear. Equally important, the case law on affirmative action is deeply rooted to a substantial degree on something called institutional academic freedom. That is, that was the original opinion in Bakke by Justice Powell, that Harvard could choose to treat diversity as a value, a substantial value in its admissions process. And that institutional academic freedom may be eviscerated in this decision. It was always pretty thin ice in terms of non-affirmative action decisions, but that's important. And that too may have consequences for theories of individual academic freedom that professors enjoy. The truth is, and you may not hear this very much, is that academic freedom as a subset of the First Amendment, freedom for professors to do their research, to speak out on issues, to conduct their classes, is a doctrine that's been on life support in the federal courts for many decades, and it may be in further jeopardy. And that means academic freedom then would be rooted entirely in state law, professional organizations, and campus rules. And that may have an impact on Jewish professors, on students, and on the directions that universities take. And we've already seen that. Academic freedom is under attack. I don't believe so in California, but it is under attack in states like Florida, Texas, and some other states. A third element of this is, as the recent Berkeley experience at Berkeley Law demonstrates, there is a war of words, there's a war of definitions, or a war of ideologies about what anti-Semitism means in the modern world. There is a complex debate taking place as to when anti-Zionism constitutes anti-Semitism and discrimination against Jews. To get it lawyer-like just for a moment, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act does not enumerate religion among the protected classes for a variety of reasons. Instead, recent national administrations, both Democrat and Republican, and the Office of Civil Rights have embraced the idea that discrimination against a religious group may be a violation of the prohibition on national origin discrimination. So treating Jewish peoplehood as a national origin designation rather than as a religion is a window with which the Office of Civil Rights has chosen to intervene at Illinois, NYU, and other universities around the country. The Office of Civil Rights has recently tried to clarify this point, but it's murky. My view is that most, but not all, Jews view Israel and Zionism as part of their religious and peoplehood identity and part of the culture and history of the Jewish people. But those who would exclude Zionists from campus life regard such matters as a critique of Israeli national policies, and only a critique of national policies, and not penalizing people for their religion or national origin. In some cases, I don't think they're sincere. In other cases, I think they just ignore the impact that they can see around them that their remarks have on many, but again, not all Jewish people. But whatever their specific intent, the impact of those pronouncements as we serve at Berkeley Law is on Jewish students, faculty, and staff, and it is palpable. This war of ideologies has yet to be settled, and the courts and the legislature legislatures, and on most university campuses, this matter has not been settled to any significant degree. Finally, and I repeat a little bit here, the danger is not so much the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. It often fails, and no university in America has adopted it as the policy of the university. Rather, it is the effort to treat Israel as a pariah, as the aggressor, as privileged, as colonizers, as people who do dastardly deeds to peaceful Palestinian people. And we see that increasingly in the professional associations. To give you one more example, the American Bar Association had a resolution on anti-Semitism, and it deleted a reference to the IRA definition of anti-Semitism from the ABA's resolution after getting some outside criticism. There are protests and attacks at more Hillels, from rock throwing to signage. There are incendiary speakers. My organization sponsored a tour of Michael Kotler, a distinguished lawyer, former member of the Knesset, by Israeli standards, a moderate. She was greeted at NYU with a sign that said, as everyone entered, Zionists are not welcome at NYU. And there were similar events at Columbia, CUNY, Yale, and elsewhere where she spoke. And part of this, I think, is why we see the polls showing declining support to Israel. The Palestinians are viewed by many as the underdog, and the Israelis and the Jews as the overdogs, as the aggressors. And that plays into broader narratives that people have as they view developments in the world. Lastly, I want to say I am a child of the Enlightenment, and what I think we need is to keep emphasizing education, not just putting out the fire, but educating people to expect moral leadership, to say that DEI includes inclusion and Jews need to be included, that's part of their mission, and to teach about the history of the Jewish people. And finally, as you all know, we've had thousands of years of varying levels of atrocity and anti-Semitism, and that is unlikely to end in our time. That's the unfortunate truth. With that, I'd be happy to try to answer your questions.
Thank you, Mark, so much. A few questions already. Please, for those who still have questions and haven't shared them, please type in the chat function at the bottom of the screen. Someone asked, my alma mater is an institutional member of MESA, M-E-S-A, whose membership voted to support BDS. Does this make my alma mater anti-Semitic? And I think some people have withdrawn their generous contributions, donations, when they feel that the place where they went to college or graduate school has turned away from Israel.
Well, you know, my organization and others vehemently opposed this resolution, and we urged all the university presidents that had, had such centers on their campus to withdraw. It's interesting, I can't remember the number, it's something like 7 or 9 are federally funded, and quietly, without fanfare, without announcements, they withdrew. I think they were afraid of losing their federal funding. The other organizations, to my knowledge, have not withdrawn. I don't know whether I can characterize the whole campus as bigoted and anti-Semitic. But I think that's a big mistake. If they had adopted a racist position or a homophobic position or a misogynist position, I have no doubt that the university would have forced withdrawal from that organization. So I don't want to overstate it, but it is a very negative development for those campuses to maintain their centers. But the federal centers, I am informed, I do not know personally, have withdrawn.
Next question is about the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. And I hear there's a controversy regarding all of its statements. What is this definition? And what is the controversy about? And does the Academic Engagement Network relate to it or advocate for one definition over another?
We endorse the definition, but we only endorse it as an educational tool. I'm speaking only for me and only as a First Amendment maven. I think some of the examples, without going into the gory details, if they were enforced by a public university, in my mind, raise severe, serious First Amendment problems. And they have to do with this hazy line I referred to between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And indeed, from a First Amendment perspective, even hate speech is constitutionally protected. People don't like to hear that, but the First Amendment was built on the Ku Klux Klan cases and other cases, which protected hate speech in many cases, or socialist speech, whatever was unpopular at the time. And so, you know, what I would say, what I prefer is, I prefer it without the examples that are given. I think I would clean that up. And I would make it clear that this is an educational tool because it does accurately depict how many Jewish people respond to the anti-Zionist rhetoric and so forth. But I would not make it into a species of university law, which I think leads to legal problems.
Next question, Jews as the other. Thus a threat, the person writes, because of multiple connections in the world. It's not only what we are, but also what we're not, dependent on here. A belief in our own or no miracles, especially the afterlife of Christianity. So,
you know, I don't know, I'm not quite sure what the question is here. You know, I like to think, I once said the history of the Jewish people is a history of constructive alienation. And one of the rabbis liked that because I think, you know, it is, you know, Einstein was a rebel, you know, and Chagall was a rebel, and we could go on, and Freud was a rebel. I'm not so hot on Freud, to be honest, but nonetheless. So, you know, in some ways, and you could say that about the African-American people, James Baldwin and some of the great thinkers and writers of the African-American community. It was alienation, but it let itself out in constructive ways that made everyone better, including their own, including their own people. You know, to me, if there's a bias on campus, it's anti-religious. You know, it's not that the Christians are still mad at us, you know, for the death of Jesus or things like that. It's a pro-secular bias where people who are faithful Christians or faithful Muslims or faithful Jews, they're just not included. That's not what they mean by inclusive. It's not what they mean by belonging. And I think that's a great loss, you know, even if it's only 8% of them. I don't know what percent it is of the students or the faculty, but I think they ought to be respected, included, but you know, I don't, and I may be misinterpreting the question. I don't see this as, you know, settling, you know, grudges that go, you know, back to, you know, Constantine and the Christian era.
One person writes, is the rise of worldwide fascism part of the problem? To which I would ask, where are the greatest dangers to Jews on campus from both radical sides or from one?
Well, you know, I mean, you know, anyone on this call could have an equally or better answer. I would say, to my mind, a broad fascism is the biggest danger, without naming the countries that we can all think of. You know, there are places where I think there's a form of fascism which embodies anti-Semitism, and it's one of its stellar, it's not concentration camps and it's not gas chambers, but it's bad, and it is really very bad. In America, I would say, in my little sliver of the world, which is university campus, is not so little because, you know, it's not Vegas. Nothing stays on campus. Whatever starts on campus moves off of campus eventually. I would say, and I don't want to say everyone, but it's elements of the progressive side that are the biggest threat. And it's the area where university, there's no harm. You denounce a swastika and denounce a fascist organization, you don't lose 7 faculty members on the whole campus, if any, right? But if you're perceived as going after the progressives on that, then that occasions another sort of, so I would say that's my honest view. I think it's more of a danger from the left on campus. Worldwide, it's more of a danger on the right. And frequently it's hard to tell the difference, to be honest with you.
Another question is about the Bakke decision and admissions on campus. What do you see happening in the near future or the next presidential term or the Supreme Court change? Where do you think that's going to go?
Well, I don't know how broad the opinion will be, you know, and you know, they could impose some heavier burden of proof to show that you engaged in past discrimination, and there are institutions which clearly did. Certainly, you know, some of our prominent institutions had quotas or policies relating to African Americans as to Jews and to other people. But now there are institutions which never practiced it that have affirmative action. They could limit it just to public universities, not private, but I think that's not likely. I think it will go to both. I don't know how universities will respond. There are certain things they may try to do. None of them are perfect, but sort of surrogates. You know, you can favor low-income people. But that doesn't always, that captures a greater percentage of Hispanic kids, but at least the data I last saw, it doesn't capture a huge percentage of the African-American kids who tend to come at least from middle-class families. Not always, some are very poor. And these top 10% or 5% or these various top percentage rules where you have racially impacted high schools, they may get a disproportionate percentage of African Americans or Hispanic or Latinos. So there are some places where it depends on the politics, but I'll just be honest, I think there are some places unnamed where there may be some cheating. They may try to say we're not doing it, and where you suspect that they are, and that becomes a proof problem. There's some places that will shut it down. Some places will do extra recruiting efforts. It's really hard to know what will happen. And the same is true of the DEI office. I mean, even without affirmative action, diversity, equity, inclusion should have a constituency, right? I mean, those are meaningful terms, although people have different definitions of equity, and some, I guess, have different definitions of diversity, but inclusion, maybe we could agree on. I think it's very hard to say. There may be some scofflaws out there. There may be some that will risk further litigation. There may be some that abandon it, and there may be alternatives, admissions policies, which seeks to approximate a more diverse student body. It's very hard to say. It's something I'll be watching very carefully.
Another question, quote, "My perception is that the more prestigious the university, the worse the anti-Semitism on campus. This is where our future leaders will come from. Is this an indicator that the situation is only going to get worse?"
I don't know if that's true. I just have to be, I mean, I'm not going to name universities, but, you know, I can think of non-Ivy League institutions that aren't Berkeley or Stanford, where the problem is quite severe. It depends on, I will make one. There are some Chicago area schools that give me much greater pause than the University of Chicago, just without naming names. So I think it tends to get the headlines. If it happens at Yale, it happens at Harvard, it happens at Columbia, it happens at Stanford, then it tends to be in the newspapers more. It's more in your consciousness. It may be in local newspapers that you don't read. But I'm not prepared to agree with that generalization.
I think we have a few more, so we'll just take 2 or 3 more. What is the best way to dispute the selection of groups that express anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism as curriculum providers in, let's say, California's ethnic studies programs in our public schools? So, and they also said Washington State. I'm not familiar with Washington. What can we do about how school districts will seek education from certain providers whose goal is to bring an anti-Zionism lesson plans to the teachers, even though that's not the purpose of the state ethnic studies curriculum?
Well, I'm not very optimistic about that. I just not. I mean, in my judgment, there were some changes made in the curriculum, which a lot of people, AMCA was very active in California on that and did a very good job. But those providers, I don't know what the percentage is, but a lot of school districts are signing up with them. So you have the problem of what's in the curriculum, and then you have the problem of what the instructors are going to say and do, because it's in the hands of people who weren't on board with the revisions that members of the Jewish community and their organizations insisted upon. I think we just need to try to document it and maybe bring it back up to the legislature again, bring it to Governor Newsom, who showed some sympathy to our position, which was to question it. But my impression is to a large extent it's been hijacked, and I don't quite know how to get this horse back into the barn. That's my honest answer.
Someone is upset that in May, there is both American Jewish Heritage Month as well as American Pacific Islander Month, but we are only hearing, according to this question, about the latter on TV or newspapers, etc. What can we do to change that? That's not really your area.
Yeah,
but
I think that's part of it. I mean, although I did hear a prominent Black actor say he didn't like African American Heritage Month because he thought every month should be African American Heritage Month. And I found myself in a position of agreeing with both sides there. Every month should be African American Heritage Month, but it's not a bad idea to highlight the achievements. But I think this gets into the notion that we are privileged and that our story is constantly being told. That the story of Chagall and Einstein and Freud and others like them, or Salk and so forth, those stories are being told, whereas the other stories are not. And that from their perspective, the suffering of Asian Americans and the suffering of African Americans and Latinos was much worse and more in the legal structure. So I don't know, but that occurs to me all the time, because every time I see somebody's Heritage Month, it's never the Jewish Heritage Month. It's always one of the other groups, and I have nothing against them and their achievements, which are many. But I think as long as we are perceived as not being the underdog, and these other groups are, as their history was more pernicious than our history, which is not entirely true. I don't think we're going to change the media. I mean, or at least large segments of the media.
I think we have 2 more questions. Someone suggests that we learn more about the students supporting Israel a new group of students who have organized on campuses to support students in grassroots pro-Israel advocacy. Have you heard of this group?
I've heard of them, and they're an outstanding group, and I should have mentioned them. I don't know much about the organization, but I've read some of the materials that they send by email. They're a presence on campus. They're important, and we ought to support them. Beyond that, I can't get into the details. I don't know how many members they have, but I know they have chapters. And periodically I get an announcement that they opened a chapter in this campus or that. And I think that's wonderful.
And there are a lot of questions about what do we, most of us, I guess, attendees are not academics and not necessarily elected officials. What can we as the average citizen do to try to reduce the anti-Semitism and attacks on Israel on campus, both in high schools and on college campuses? And is there any organization, in addition to your organization, that we should support?
Well, ADL, JCRC, in some areas, I guess JCR and Hillel International, but I guess they're primarily on campus. Well, I have, not many suggestions, but one is support those organizations that are on campus. I'm not asking for support for my organization, but Rabbi Adam could use your support at Hillel. The Chabad could use your support. Those are important players on campus. So that's one thing. And listen to the students and listen to the faculty to know what's really going on. Second is many people on this call are influential people in their own communities. You need to establish a relationship. When Abe Foxman was at the ADL, we had a relationship. I told the chancellors that was the first call they made when they had a real problem. Get his advice, not only because he could be supportive, but he could give them good advice on how to deal with the crisis. But you never want to make a cold call. Don't introduce yourself to Michael Drake for the first time. And don't just send them a letter out of the blue. Do your best. And maybe it's not Michael, maybe it's an aide, maybe it's a vice president, maybe it's Carol Christa, by the way, I think has been very strong on our issues. I'm a big admirer of what Carol's done at Berkeley. Establish those relationships now. And that way, when there is a crisis, do it. The third thing is to come in and offer to help. Say, look, it's not just one incident. You may see an iceberg, but we see an understructure here. You need something in your orientation program. You need training for your mid-level executives. You need training for student leaders. NYU has done all this stuff, and they do it well. And so I think we have to be a voice of reason. We need to have the connections early, and you need to support the organizations which are functioning well on campus and will have a say in these deliberations.
Thank you so much. I want to wish everyone again Chag Sameach, happy Shavuot, a lot of dairy if you're not lactose intolerant. And Mark, thank you so much for your generosity of spirit, for sharing your knowledge with us. Everyone, thank you, and we'll see you at a future program.
Chag Sameach, thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye.